Welcome to my 1,000 square foot 2-bedroom house. This house was built in 1946, and you may have seen it before. If you have, you probably know that I've pretty much remodeled every room. I started with the master bedroom, then I moved on to the second, which I regretfully didn't film. Sorry about that. Then I did the living room and dining room, kind of made it one open space. Then I did the bathroom, and finally the kitchen. All of these remodels have dedicated videos on them. If you're interested, I will leave links in the description of this video over to all of them. The one area that was left in my house was this little kind of awkward extension of the living room. We used it as an office for a while, then it was a temporary living room and a temporary kitchen when we remodeled those rooms, but it never really had a purpose. So we finally made the decision to turn it into a bedroom. We figured this would add value to the house if we ever decide to sell it, and it would finally give that area of the house a purpose. We closed up the entrance to that room from the living room when we remodeled it, and you would think that all I would have to do to make it a bedroom is build a wall at the other entrance with a doorway, and really I could have just done that, but I decided to do a lot more before I could call it a bedroom. This project was interesting. The kitchen and hallway also got done at the same time, so this is kind of like a 3-in-1 remodel. There's a bit of jumping around in this video, so I'll do my best to explain exactly what I'm doing and why I did it. So, here we go. The first thing I started with was to build the wall that would close off this room. This wall will also act as the new load-bearing wall for the center of the house. It worked out that where I wanted the wall was directly over the main beam in the basement, which is really good because the original bearing wall that was in the hallway anyways was in the center of the joist span and actually caused them all to dip, which we'll come back to later in the video. I also had to check in the attic to make sure these joists weren't cut over the bearing wall, as a lot of times they are. These ceiling joists are actually 2x6s that run 20 feet. They pretty much span the entire width of the house, and they're also 24 inches apart. So even though they're not cut, they still need to be supported in the middle because they're undersized for the span. I have to build this wall anyways, but that's just a little extra info for you. Before I started framing, I needed to open things up to see what I was dealing with. Everything in this area of the house is going to be completely gutted, as you'll see, but for right now, I only did what I had to get the wall built. I suppose it's also worth mentioning that I tested for asbestos before starting this project, and anything you see me rip out was free and clear of the dreaded A word. Once I removed a strip of the ceiling, some paneling, drywall, and carpet, I was ready to start framing. I decided to run the wall in front of the old 2x3 bearing wall. I was still able to have the new wall sit fully on top of the beam in the basement, and this 2x3 wall will eventually be coming out, but that is for another video. I set up some bottle jacks so I could raise the ceiling a little bit to take some weight off of the wall in the hallway, and then removed all the paneling and drywall from it. That way I can wiggle the studs just by hand to see if the jacks are doing anything, and they did. So once I got the weight off the wall and got the ceiling to be somewhat level as possible for my house anyways, I was able to start putting in studs. And since this is a load-bearing wall and I'm putting a door opening here, I needed to add a header to my framing. I used two 2x6s with a piece of plywood sandwiched in between. So I put that header in, put my jack studs in, and once the ceiling was supported, I was able to remove the hallway wall, which was pretty satisfying, not gonna lie. Okay, so the ceiling joists in the hallway are supported by the new wall. Now I basically want to demo the entire hallway, starting with this box right here. This is called a chase, and it's hiding the old cast iron vent that no longer serves a purpose. At some point the bathroom was moved and they just eliminated this, so they cut it in the basement and they left it going through the roof. When I re-roofed the house, I cut the top of it off, but now it was time to remove it completely. I started by following another old vent that was attached to it and removed that. Then it was time for the fun part. I rented a chain pipe cutter. I will say that if you ever have to get rid of a cast iron stack like this, I highly recommend this chain cutter. It was really easy to use and actually a lot of fun. Just make sure to have someone help you because this pipe can be really heavy. Next was the archway that went from the kitchen into the hallway. Some people like these, some don't, so if you're one that does, I'm sorry. I just wanted it gone so I could have one continuous ceiling going from the kitchen into the hallway that would have crown molding that goes around the entire house, basically from the living room into the kitchen and down the hall. Plus, taking this out also gave us about 6 more inches of clearance. After the archway, I started tearing out this closet. Neither the archway or this closet were load-bearing, by the way. I made sure to check, just in case, but it became pretty obvious once I started tearing it apart. My plan with this area is to extend the closet out a little bit and make 2 closets back to back. One will be for the new bedroom, and the other will be a linen closet for the hallway. As you can see, I have the bulkhead for the basement stairs right here, so I'll have to work around that. Now that this area is cleared out, I can check out just how much this floor sank. I set up some string lines at different spots so you can really see it. This is why I wanted everything demoed, so I could fix the floor. It's best to work from the bottom level up when doing something like this, and that's exactly what I did before I built any of the walls in the hallway. So I headed to the basement with some floor jacks to raise the joists up to where they're better. I say better because they will never be perfect. Without getting into too much detail, this is an old house. Everything has sank over time and at different rates. The foundation, the beam, it's just never going to be perfect. So I just wanted it to be as good as I possibly could make it. So I took the dip out of the floor and scissored up the floor joists. So basically I raised the floor up using the floor jacks and some 2x4s. I install new joists, glue them, nail them, and screw them in place, and then I can lower the jacks. This was not the only spot that needed to be fixed down here. The rest of the floor framing was not great. I went into a ton of detail about this in other videos, but for the sake of this video, I'll just say that I basically reframed this entire area. I was able to get the dip out of the hallway and the floor all straightened out along the kitchen wall, so now it was time to finish out the framing. I hopped back into the bedroom to do some more demo in order to continue building the new load-bearing wall, starting with this cool little mirrored shelf thing that actually gave me some trouble. But once I was able to remove the glass without breaking anything, I was able to see that someone left their mark the last time the room was remodeled in 1964. So that was really cool to see. I removed the rest of the paneling and drywall and anything else that was in my way. As I said earlier, this 2x3 wall will eventually be removed. There's some shelves on the other side of it in the basement stairwell area that I think I can redo and make very usable, and I'll actually get a little more room since I'm holding this new wall out a bit. Always good to keep that kind of stuff in mind when remodeling. I used a chalk line to make a nice straight line for the top and bottom plates to follow, and I installed those. I'm using a double top plate here, by the way, since this is a load-bearing wall. As of right now, this ceiling does not have a ton of weight on it, but another part of this remodel is to make the ceiling stronger so I can use it for storage up in the attic. More on that later. Then I set up my trusty bottle jacks again, so I could raise the ceiling to level, since it did drop over the years, and at the same time this took the weight off the old wall, so I'll have no worries about that in the future when I go to remove it. Then I just filled in the studs at 16 inches on center where I needed them, and I just left them out in the area where the closet door is going. Before I frame that door, I jump out to the hallway to figure out exactly how all that's going to work. I decided to extend the kitchen wall to make the hallway nice and straight instead of having a jog like it did before, and I marked the closet layout on the floor to make sure everything would be in a good location and that everything would be nice and square. Once I decided everything was good, I installed the bottom plates, and then I plumbed those lines up, cut the ceiling back in order to install them, and now I had a decision to make. No matter what, this little bulkhead slope thing for the basement stairs is gonna be here. But if it was gonna be there, I wanted it to be for a good reason. At this point, I had this bulkhead sticking out, and I still had terrible head height going down the stairs. So after some debate, I decided to change that. Not only was the head height awful, but the floor jetted out into the stairwell, so I wanted to fix it all while I was doing this. Fixing all this meant that the bulkhead would get bigger, and I would just have to make it work in the closets. I thought about making it into a square box, but I decided to keep it angled, Either way, the trade-off of being able to walk down the stairs without having to duck and dodge was all going to be worth it to me. Even though this meant more framing in the basement and lots of measuring and thinking and cutting and ultimately ending up with a bigger bulkhead. I will tell you that months later, it is still one of my favorite things for functionality that I've done to my house. I used half-inch plywood for the sides and top of the bulkhead. I'll be covering this up with drywall eventually, but I figured this would make it more solid. And then I built a wall in the middle to create the two closets. I used 2x4s on the flat to get as much room as possible. This bedroom closet will be 24 inches deep by 3 foot wide, and the linen closet is going to be slightly less deep at about 21 inches. Now that I had the closets exactly where I needed them, I could frame in the doorways. I used the same 2x6 header for the bedroom closet door, but I didn't need a header for the linen closet as that wall was not load bearing. And I actually built this wall out of 2x3s. I ended up bumping them out the thickness of 2x4s later on in the project to make finishing everything easier, but I don't think I filmed that, so if they magically turn into 2x4s at some point in the video, that's why. While doing all this framing in the hallway, I noticed that this wall was built out of square. You could see just how bad it was using the floor tile as a reference, and would definitely be able to see it when this is all finished, so I had to fix it. This wall was also going to be important because it was going to determine where I put my refrigerator panel when I did the kitchen, and that would tell me where to put the rest of the cabinets along the wall. So I tore off a section of drywall, bumped out the old framing to where it needed to be to make it straight, and after installing a new piece of drywall and a few layers of joint compound, it was looking much better. Instead of patching in the ceiling in the hallway, I'm just going to tear it all out and start fresh, but I'm not tearing out the ceiling in the kitchen. And after tearing out the archway, I realized the ceiling heights were not going to match. This was because of the different layers of tiles and drywall that were used over the years. This was actually a pretty simple fix as I was tearing out the drywall anyways. All I had to do was add some pieces to the strapping to match the kitchen ceiling height. This also gave me an opportunity to make the ceiling straight as it was not perfect before, but a few shims later, it was right where it needed to be. Now I had to patch in the floor wherever I removed a wall, basically. I did say earlier in the video that I tested for asbestos, and anything you see me tear out was negative, but unfortunately one thing did come back positive. It was the old funky looking yellow and green vinyl floor that was in the kitchen, and it also ran into the hallway a little bit. So I weighed my options and really didn't want to spend all kinds of money removing it. I decided I'm just going to patch the floor up to the height and go right over it. I know doing all this work and then putting a floating floor down might sound silly to some people, but I did not want to pay for it to be ripped up and disturbed, and maybe later on down the road, but for now, that's all I'm doing. Just patching it up and going right over it. At this point in the renovation, I had everything to a place where I could start working on the kitchen. I'm not going to go into detail on the entire project because we would be here forever, and I made a dedicated video for it, so if you're interested in watching it after this one, there'll be a link down in the description of this video over to where you can watch it. I did do some work in the hallway at the same time as the kitchen. For instance, the wiring. While I was doing that in the kitchen, I also ran wires for some recessed hallway lights, a switch for those lights, and an outlet. Later on, I'll also be installing a smoke detector / carbon monoxide detector, but I'll be able to easily add that from the attic because I have access. I really just wanted to get the wires running the wall. I also threw up some temporary insulation because it was getting colder at this point in the project, and then I added a vapor barrier to the underside of the strapping, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the video when I install it in the bedroom. Next was to close everything up. I covered up the ceiling and the walls with 1/2-inch drywall. I figured this would be a nice big step checked off the list, and this would make it so that everything outside of the bedroom would be closed up. This would also allow me to work in the bedroom without getting too much dust throughout the house, and keep my little guy out of the danger zone. All I had to do was close off the doorway, which I will do very soon in the video, and then I did 3 coats of joint compound throughout the kitchen, hallway, and closet. The ceiling heights matched up perfectly, by the way, which made me really happy. Then I sanded everything out and primed everything. I waited on the final wall color, but painted the ceiling a flat white to match all the other ceilings. Really, the big reasons for doing all that work in the hallway before the kitchen was to get that refrigerator panel where it needed to be, so I could figure out my cabinets, as I said earlier in the video, and I wanted all the old walls in the hallway removed and the new ones in place so that I could run the flooring from the hallway into the kitchen. If I didn't take care of those walls, I would have had to wait on the floor. Again, I'm using a floating floor, and I'm not 100% sold on the transition between it and the real hardwood, but I do love the look of the floor on its own and how it looks with the kitchen in general. I also ran my crown molding to get that step out of the way. Besides, I really wanted to see how it looked tied into the cabinet crown, and I think it came out pretty good. So we can fast forward, and now the kitchen is done. The hallway is getting there, but before I finish it, I want to get in the bedroom and get that done. So finally, I got it all cleared out, and the first thing I do is install the door. I know you're probably thinking this room isn't even gutted. Why install the door? Same reason I wanted to drywall the hallway, just to keep the dust down and my son out while I work. Having a functional door like this, I think, is way better than a piece of plastic. I'll just have to take the trim off and reinstall it when it comes time to do the drywall. The next thing I did was remove the old window and install a replacement window. The old window was barely functional and had single pane glass. Really, it was just kind of a mess. Replacement windows are actually pretty easy. Just remove the sashes, cut the window weights, take out the pulleys, and in my case I had to take out a storm window, but after that you just put the new window in place, make sure it's plumb and level, and just screw it in. Now I have a functional window, which is great because it's gonna get dusty. I have to say, I love demo. Probably because it's the part of the job where you can just put in some earbuds and listen to some music or a podcast and go to town. The only spot that I had to be careful with in this room was when I removed the nails holding on the baseboard heat backing. I just wanted to be careful not to disturb the pipe too much. I decided to leave the pipe and the heating element but replace the covers. Everything else is pretty easy. The old trim, paneling, drywall, it's all pretty straightforward. I leave the insulation in the one exterior wall for now to keep the heat in, but that's it. If you're wondering why I'm gutting this room, by the way, there's a few reasons. I want to bring the insulation up to code, first of all, and I'm also adding sound and fire insulation to the interior walls. I also want to check for any issues like mold, rot, or mice-chewed wires, which I have found plenty of before in this house, and it just makes it easier to start from scratch. I also tear up the old floorboards in the attic because I needed to add some framing to the ceiling. There was virtually no insulation up here too. That will definitely be changing. The last thing to go was the old ceiling tiles and the drywall that was hiding behind them, and then the room was down to the bones, right back to the original 1946 framing.
Almost ready for paint.
As you can see here, the access for the attic is currently in the bedroom. I almost left it there, but decided it wasn't the best place for it. So the next thing on the list is to move it to the hallway. I thought this would be a way better spot for it. First step was to mark out exactly where I wanted it, and then I drilled 4 pilot holes up through the ceiling in each corner of the opening. These holes will be a reference for where I need to put the framing up in the attic. As you saw earlier, I installed some junction boxes for some hallway lights because I didn't think that the ladder was going to go there, so I just had to move those, which wasn't a big deal. Then I cut out some cross bracing and played connect the dots with the pilot holes. Then I got to framing. I had one 2x6 running the length of the new opening, so I needed to carefully cut that out. I wasn't worried about having to support it from below because the only weight on it really was a small section of ceiling. I could go into a bunch of detail on exactly how I framed this and why, but really all I did was that I made sure the new framing was enough to support the existing ceiling and the weight of the ladder itself with a person on it and whatever weight they might be carrying. I also had to make sure that I had plenty of framing in place to be able to attach the ladder. The positioning of the fasteners are pretty low on the ladder's frame, so I needed to cut out the strapping and drop down some 2x6s down to the drywall. This will allow me to get plenty of material to attach the fasteners to, and it will also act as strapping for the drywall below. Then I cut the vapor barrier out and cut out the drywall. The tricky thing about installing this ladder is that you need to have the ladder open to remove all of the screws that hold it in, so I had to support the frame so that I could open the ladder, stand on it, and remove all the screws without it crashing down with me on it. Once it was completely free, I just had to push it up and slide it over to the new opening. To make the installation easier in the hallway, I attached a couple 2x4s to catch the ladder. Then I centered it in the hallway and installed the 2 side pieces of trim. With the trim installed, I can take out the 2x4s. It's enough to hold the ladder up while I install the shims and screws that really hold it in place. The last steps were to cut the ladder to length, finish the trim, and move the light switch for the attic lights. I mentioned earlier in the video that I wanted to strengthen the ceiling above the bedroom so that I could use it for storage and not have to worry about overloading it. So that's what I did next. All I wanted to do was sister up the existing 2x6s with 2x8s. Even though the joist would still be 24-inch on center, this would make it so the ceiling is a lot stronger. All I had to do was cut the cross bracing back 1.5 inches and drop the 2x8s in, making sure that each end sat on the top of the walls. The way this house was framed is kind of funky. Usually you have the rafters sit directly on top of the exterior wall, and then the joists sit on the wall, and you tie them together with nails. This prevents the walls from bowing out at the top due to the weight of the roof, but instead they did this. I honestly don't even know what the term for this type of framing is, if there even is a term, but just as an extra step while this was all opened up, I decided to use some heavy-duty metal brackets and some structural screws to tie the joists into the rafters. The house hasn't moved since 1946, but I figured why not. As I was installing the 2x8s, I did have to raise some of the old joists in the middle before I nailed them off because they sagged a bit over the years, but other than that, the installation of the rest of them was pretty easy. Then I filled in the strapping wherever it was missing and re-nailed it to every new joist. Over the years, the nails can loosen up, so this would make sure the ceiling has no movement at all. Speaking of nails, I also added nailers anywhere I needed them. These are so I'll have something to screw my drywall to and have something to nail my trim into when I get to that step. Next up is wiring. In Massachusetts, I'm allowed to do my own electrical work, but I don't claim to be a master electrician, and I don't recommend you do any wiring if you are uncomfortable with it. Definitely call a licensed electrician if you need one. So because of that, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail with this, but I'll just give you a basic rundown of what I did. First thing I did was install all of the receptacle boxes. I used insulated boxes on the exterior wall as required by code. Then I used a simple formula to figure out where the ceiling lights were going so I could run those wires. I'm putting in 4 recessed canless lights, and with these, all you do is install the junction box for them, and you cut the light in after the drywall's done. Then I just ran all of my wire. I also put the hallway lights where they needed to be since I removed them when I did the attic ladder. The other thing I was adding to this circuit was some hardwired smoke detectors. I figured since I was doing all this work, this would be a good idea. Technically, I don't think I needed them, but I'm going to sleep better at night knowing they're all on all the time, and that if one goes off, they all go off because they're interconnected. I really didn't have much old wiring to remove. In fact, this room only had 2 outlets, and I took one of them out during the living room remodel, but any old wires that were still in the bedroom, the attic, or the basement were removed, and the wiring was done. After successfully passing my wiring inspection, I was able to insulate. I started in the attic, and since it can get really cold here in New England in the winter, I wanted to insulate everything as best as I possibly could. Since I want more insulation and still want the attic to be usable, I'm running 2x6s on top of the old joists. This will allow me to add R30 on top of the R19 to bring the total R value to R49. Adding these 2x6s will also allow me to add plywood that I will be able to use for storage. For now, all I did was add a walkway, and I actually dropped the plywood down closer to the attic ladder to make going up and down the ladder a little safer. From inside the bedroom, all I did was fluff up the insulation a little bit, make sure every space was filled, and then I could add my vapor barrier. In place of the paper, I'm using 6mm plastic sheeting. Either one will work the same way, I just find it easier to do it this way. Sometimes cutting the faced insulation can get a little tricky and you end up having spaces that are missing paper. With the plastic, you'll never have that problem. Now it was time to tackle the one exterior wall. I start by removing all the old insulation. This stuff was probably about an inch or an inch and a half thick, not much R value at all. I needed to add a couple 2x4s to the sides of the window where the window weights used to be. This will give me something to nail my window trim to. Then I cut back the old window jamb even with the framing and started tucking in insulation in all the smaller openings around the window. You can also use spray foam for this kind of thing, but I really don't like spray foam. We won't get into that right now though. Before I filled in any of the wall cavities, I went around to all the holes in the framing and filled them with fire barrier sealant. Basically any spot a new wire or a hole from an old wire is that goes up from the bedroom to the attic or down from the bedroom to the basement gets filled in. This is a code requirement in my area and is so that fire can't spread as easy from floor to floor. Then I could install my R15. I did use faced on this wall because the framing is 16 inches on center, and that's exactly what these bats are made for, so they just slip into place and the paper gets stapled to the studs. Before I drywalled, I wanted to add fire and sound insulation, or mineral wool, to all of the interior walls. This stuff is really easy to work with. It doesn't need a vapor barrier unless you're using it on the exterior walls, which you can, by the way. Cutting it is really easy. I like to use an old kitchen knife, so I just filled in every little void in the rest of the walls. This will be great for sound, and of course the fire resistance is a huge bonus. Next up is drywall. Here is my biggest tip about drywall. Don't do it by yourself. But of course I didn't follow my own advice. Since I was on my own doing this, I used 2x3 blocks to be my helper, to help hold up the ceiling sheets while I screwed them into the strapping. You can also rent a drywall jack or a panel jack to help you, but I've always found them to be more trouble than they're worth when you're hanging a small ceiling like this. People have different opinions on how to hang drywall, but the way I always do it is to hang the ceiling first, then I hang the walls horizontal, in other words, not straight up and down, so there's one seam between the sheets from floor to ceiling. I always like to stagger my seams. I put the top sheets up first and then the bottom sheets. I use a rotary saw to cut out window openings and electrical boxes, and I just make sure there's plenty of screws in each sheet. That's really it. I think drywall is one of those things that might look like a mystery, but I really believe anyone can do it. Taping and mudding, on the other hand, is a little more tricky. Really, the only way to get good at it is to do it over and over and over again. I've done it enough to be pretty good at it, but I know I'm not the best. I like to use a product called Durabond for my first coat. It's a powder that you mix with water. It cures really quickly and very hard, which is why I use it for a tape coat. I like to use paper tape in the corners, and I just started using a product called FiberFuse tape for the flat seams, and I don't think I'll ever use anything else again because it's great. After the tape coat, I do 2 more thin coats with pre-mixed USG lightweight joint compound. I just add about a cup of water to the bucket and mix it up to make it easier to spread. There's a couple options out there, this is just my preference. I also took out the rest of the carpet while I was doing this and exposed the old sweet vinyl floor. This one's probably from about the 60s. You'll also see that I have a dehumidifier running here. This just helps the mud dry out faster. Just don't leave it in the room. When you go to sand it out, it'll clog up the filter. The goal of the joint compound is to make everything look perfectly flat, like it's one big piece of drywall. So just cover the tape and feather the edges of the compound and carefully sand it all out smooth. If you've ever done it before, you will know that sanding is not fun. This is why it's important to get better at applying the joint compound. The better you get at that, the easier the sanding will be. I use a sanding pole to knock down all the high spots, and then I use a fine sanding sponge to make things perfect. I use a nice bright battery-powered light that I can move around, and I hold it at an angle against the walls to see better where I need to sand. Then I clean everything up, making sure the room is as dust-free as possible. I attach a soft paintbrush to my shop vac to get all the dust off the ceiling and the walls, and then I prime everything. I'm using Kiehl's PVA primer. This is specifically made to prime and seal drywall. It goes on just like paint. If you don't use primer, sometimes depending on the color or quality of paint, you could have the joint compound showing through. You'd probably have to do 2 or 3 coats, even though I am going to do 2 on here anyways after this primer. Once the primer is dry, I mix up some joint compound with a little blue chalk to do some touch-ups. The primer helps to highlight any imperfections, and I go around and touch up all of the spots that I see. I added the blue chalk because it's easier to see against a white wall since joint compound is white. I may have been a little critical with the touch-ups here, but at least I know it will be as perfect as I could get it. Then I carefully sanded all the patches out and painted the ceiling with 2 coats of flat white ceiling paint. I also used this paint for the closet ceiling walls and the bulkhead. This is already one thing I regret. I should have used a semi-gloss or an eggshell in the closet so it wouldn't scuff so easy. But you live and you learn. Before I did the wall paint, I wanted to get the lights on, so I decided to just hook everything up. I wired in all the outlets and the switches and referenced my drawing to find out where all the ceiling lights are. I marked those out, cut the holes, and installed them. They just get plugged in and popped into place. They're held up with 2 little springy arm things. I know that's very technical terminology. I even put one in the closet. These particular lights are really cool. They're halo ultra thin downlights, and as you can see here, even if you land dead center of a piece of strapping or a joist, you can still install them with no issues. I also cut in the box for the smoke detector in this room, but waited to install it. I just capped those wires and was able to get the power on. Now it's time to finish painting. I'm using Behr paint. This is the paint with primer mixed in. In the past few years, I've actually used this paint a lot, and I'm pretty impressed with it. This color is called Antique White. Paint color is really hard to pick. It feels like such a commitment. Luckily, we ended up loving this color. Once it was painted, I installed all the covers for the outlets and switches, and then I installed the smoke and CO2 detectors in all the bedrooms, the hallway, and one in the basement. Oh, and I told you I would show you the hallway lights. Check them out. They have a night light, and they're dimmable, just like the bedroom lights. Pretty cool. Now I can finally install the floor. I'm doing an LVP floating floor in here as well. It's the same type of floor, but it's a different color. I could have run the hallway floor into the bedroom, but the wife really wanted this floor, so yeah, she won that one. Before I laid the floor down, I installed screws into the joists about every 6 inches to get rid of the squeaks, and I cut back some of the old vinyl where it overlapped so I wouldn't have any raised areas, scraped up any joint compound, sweeped it up, and installed the floor. LVP is another thing that I think anyone can do. You just have to follow the instructions on the box because different brands have specific instructions for that particular floor. In general though, just make sure you use spacers against the walls to allow for expansion and contraction as it does have to move around, and make sure the planks are locked in together properly. If you want to see the dedicated video I made for how to install vinyl plank, there will be a link in the description of this video to where you can see it. Next up is the baseboard heat, backing, and covers. Before I installed them, I cleaned out the years of dust and debris from the heating element. Then the install was really easy. I just bend the tabs back that hold the element up so I can sneak the backing into place, bend the tabs back, and screw the backing into the studs. Then I put the covers on and the end caps on each end. I also made sure they were hinged because there is a little bleeder valve that I may or may not have to get to in the future. I reinstalled the door trim because I had to take that off before I drywalled. Then I installed the closet door. Now that the floor was done, I could install all the baseboard trim. I always cope the inside corners because I just think they come out so much better this way, and I ended up having to scribe one piece of base because the floor was all kinds of funky. Really nothing I could have done about it unless I tore up the floor completely and shimmed the framing, or I used leveler on the entire floor. The floor didn't sink or anything like that, that's just how it was framed back in the day, and I'm okay with it. I just filled in the rest of the pieces, and then I had to deal with the closet. I decided to rip a piece of pine down at an angle and put a board down here to kind of stop anything from dropping into this space and losing it forever. Putting this piece like this also made it so that I could install the baseboard in the closet without doing anything too tricky. To finish the closet off, I installed shelving. And like it or not, wire shelving is really, really easy, and the system I used makes it very adjustable. Some people think it looks cheap or outdated, and there's all kinds of videos out there on how to cover it up to make it look quote-unquote better. First of all, I can assure you that it's not cheap. It's kind of pricey actually, and second, it's going to be covered up by all the stuff you jam into a third bedroom closet anyways. I'm all about functionality, and I think it's going to work out great. The last of the trim in this room was the window. First thing I did was extended the jamb out even to the drywall. I did this first so that I could add even more insulation. Again, you can use spray foam here, but I prefer fiberglass. Then I installed the casing. I just did a simple picture frame window instead of having a sill. So 4 pieces all the way around with 45s on the ends, easy peasy, and it was done. Now I had to prep and paint all the trim. I filled all the nail holes and caulked in all the corners and to the wall and painted everything with a semi-gloss bright white. I painted both of the doors with the same trim paint, and after 2 coats on everything and a few touch-ups here and there on the walls and in the closet, the bedroom was done. Whew. Let's take a breather. Alright, we're almost there, guys. This is the final stretch. I jump back out into the hallway to finish what I started. For the closet door, I decided a bifold would be best. A regular door would pretty much take up the entire width of the hallway when open, and I didn't have enough space for a pocket door. So I basically built a cased opening with some 3/4 pine and window trim on the floor. Then I stood it up in place and installed it. I shimmed it from the backside and nailed it into place. Then I installed the bifold. These are really easy, especially if you're the one creating the opening for it. If you plan it correctly, you won't have to cut it down. You can just install the hardware and put it into place. After I installed it though, I realized that because of the angle of the bulkhead, I wanted it to pivot the other way. But because the door is so easy to install, it was very easy to change the swing of it. Next up was shelves for the closet. And you may be happy to know, I didn't do wire shelving in here. First thing I did was made a similar small items dropped and gone forever blocker at the bottom of the bulkhead. Then I attached some cleats to the walls anywhere I wanted a shelf. I decided to make 3. The one downside to these shelves is that they'll be stationary, so it took a while to figure out exactly where I wanted them. Once the cleats were attached, I gave everything a finish coat of paint. Then I cut 3 shelves out of 3/4 cabinet grade plywood. I painted one side of each of them. This will be the bottom side. I want the top of them to be a sealed natural wood finish. Once the paint was dry, I installed them. I glued and screwed the top shelf into place, and then the lower 2 I just used glue and nails, so I wouldn't have to fill in any big screw holes. Then I added some trim pieces to the front to hide the edges of the plywood and to make the cleats a little less noticeable. This is a similar design to my pantry that I redid in the kitchen. The idea was to make it match since it was in the same general area. I added some filler pieces to the bottom of the top shelf and filled in any nail holes. I had a special plan for the bottom of the top shelf. During the demo stage of this project, I saved one piece of the old wood paneling. This was my way of incorporating a piece of the house's history into this remodel. It's one of those little things that nobody will ever know about, but I will. Well, you know, but that's it. Then I sanded everything out and did 3 coats of water-based polyurethane on top of the shelves. I lightly sanded and cleaned up all the dust with a tack cloth in between coats. This gave the shelves a nice, smooth, easy to clean finish. Last step in the closet was to do one more coat of trim paint on the bottom of the shelves and to paint the face of them. And I think they came out great. I also did a couple of coats of paint on the closet door before reinstalling it. All that was left to do was install the baseboard trim, prep and paint the crown molding, baseboard, door trim, and doors, including the attic door, and then I painted the walls. This is a Benjamin Moore color called Ice Cube Silver, which was also a tough decision, but I love it, and luckily, so does the wife. I started this project over a year ago, and I'm finally happy to say we now have a fully remodeled kitchen, a redesigned hallway, and we've added a third bedroom to our house. And it's always nice to have an extra room because you never know what might happen.